Oil and gas are the lifeblood of 20th century living, but at what price? Recent unrest in Ukraine has highlighted Europe's reliance on Russia for its energy supplies, and it's not alone. So how has the once tightly controlled energy industry become such a bargaining chip? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. It keeps the lights on, our transport systems running and businesses on track. Without it, modern life would simply not function. Energy is at the center of our lives and, as recent events have shown, a key influence in the cause and consequences of conflicts around the world. Ukraine, Libya, Iraq scratch beneath the surface, and energy will play some, if not the major role in the outcome. As Anita McNaught explains for Inside Story.
Underpinning the military maneuvers of Russia in the Crimean Peninsula is the implicit threat of energy disruption. About half of Russian gas exports pass through Ukraine, and Russia supplies about a third of Europe and Turkey's gas. That gas provides vital income to Russia. Whatever the territorial and political disputes, there are vested interests on all sides not to destroy vital energy infrastructure. No one likes being dependent on one energy source, which is why a country like Turkey has been encouraging alternative oil and gas pipeline routes from all its neighbours to export globally. But new routes and influence over oil movements is politically charged. Relations between Turkey and Iraq are growing tense as the two countries battle for control over Kurdish oil exports. Turkey has built new pipelines out of fields like Tak in the northern Iraqi semi-autonomous region of Kurdistan. Turkey's storing 1 million barrels of Kurdish oil, while the three governments argue over how to share the revenue. Baghdad's begun to throttle its regional payments to Kurdistan in punishment, which now has a budget crisis as a result. Libya, before the uprising against Gaddafi, had a small but immaculate and well-maintained oil industry. Revolutionary chaos degraded and destroyed facilities, and political instability has failed to restore good management. Now the oil is up for grabs, which is just what a militia group did in March, bringing in an oil tanker with mysterious ownership and sailing it defiantly out to sea, only to have it seized and returned by the US Navy. In the background is the largely untapped energy potential of countries like Iran, contained by long-standing sanctions. But a resolution of its political standoff with the United States over nuclear development could lead to the re-entry of Iran to world oil and gas markets, while conversely, a worsening of relations could jeopardize security in the vital Straits of Hormuz, where 20% of the world's total supply of oil passes Iran's coast every day. Anita McNaught for Inside Story.
Well, there's plenty to discuss, so let's get the thoughts of our guests. From London, Mamdouh Salameh, international oil economist and consultant on oil and energy to the World Bank. Also from London, independent oil and energy analyst from MRL Corporation, Cornelia Mayer. And from New York, Ben van Heuvelen, managing editor of Iraq Oil Report and contributor to the Washington Post and Foreign Policy magazine. Let's begin with Mamdouh Salameh. On the face of it, the energy supplies had nothing to do with the Crimean crisis. Yet now the question of gas supplies becomes a consequence of it. Would you agree this is part of a recurring pattern?
Vis-à-vis the gas supplies from the Ukraine to Europe, this is a very important economic and strategic issue. The European Union will continue for the foreseeable future to depend on the gas supplies from Russia to the European Union to the tune of 30%, but there is also dependence on oil supplies as well. So talking about the Ukraine, you cannot separate a political issue from the energy and oil issues.
Well, Ben van Heuvelen, your view on that, you cannot separate out these particular issues.
That's certainly been my experience in covering oil and gas issues throughout the Middle East. When countries look at their national interest and decide how to act in relationship to other countries, one of their primary considerations is the health of their economy, which depends on the availability and the price of the energy that they're consuming. So absolutely, it's a vital strategic calculation for any country, and that certainly applies in the Russian situation.
Well, Cornelia Meyer, your view on this, we hear strategic calculation, yet we look at conflicts like Crimea. Was there a strategic calculation within that at the end or in the middle of this ongoing crisis, there is now going to be questions about gas supplies to Europe as a whole?
Yes, there will be questions, but what we have to see is the huge interdependence of Russia and Europe. As the previous speaker said, 30% of Russian gas comes from Europe's supply comes from Russia. And what we see is that the Russian energy sector also needs European funding. We have huge capital expenditure programs in both Rosneft and Gazprom, so they need the Russian funding. So in the end, they will need to work together. The countries most dependent are really Ukraine, Romania and Bulgaria, so they are most dependent. But what we can see also is that the current summit in the EU on the current agenda. Crimea is there, but it's there quite lower down after the economic crisis and banking union.
Well, Mamdouh Salameh, we heard there that it is not a one-way process. Looking at the example of Crimea, staying with that at the moment, is that Russia also relies on the income from its sales. It is not just purely Russia putting the gas out into Europe, it is getting the income back. It's a massive part of its budget.
Russia depends quite a lot on the revenue it gets from its gas and oil supplies to Europe. So in a way, Russia will do everything possible not to jeopardize its gas infrastructure, which 50% of gas supplies to the European Union goes through the Ukraine. So I am convinced that Russia will do everything possible to avoid escalating the conflict with the Ukraine other than the Crimea, because they don't want to jeopardize their revenue from the European Union for the gas and oil supplies. On that matter, I think that's why the European Union, particularly France and Germany, are objecting to heavy sanctions against Russia, because particularly Germany has a lot of vested interests there, and they don't want to squeeze Russia into a corner. Anyway, they cannot squeeze Russia into a corner. It's too big for that.
Well, Ben van Heuvelen, as long as the lights stay on and the cars keep running, the public tends not to think that much about energy supplies. People tend to shrug shoulders and say, well, you know, this always gets sorted out in the end. Does it always get sorted out in the end? Will it always be sorted out in the end?
I think the question is not so much, will the lights turn out? Will the electricity be turned off? Will there be empty gas stations? The question is, how much will it all cost? And what will be the effect on economic growth in Europe and around the world? I think the reality is that, first of all, in terms of gas supply, the more expensive gas is, the more expensive it is to run a factory, the more expensive it is for you to heat your home, to turn the lights on. So there are ripple effects throughout the entire economy. In terms of oil, if there were a serious reduction in oil supply from Russia, oil is a global commodity. That's a global price. And so if supplies were to drop from Russia, that would translate directly to larger prices at the pump, not only in Europe and the places that are buying directly from Russia, but also in the United States.
But let's take a look at the world suppliers of oil and gas. Now, as we heard, Oil continues to be one of the most lucrative commodities in the world. Saudi Arabia sits on over 260 billion barrels of oil. It's the world's biggest oil producer, accounting for 13% of production. That's nearly 12 million barrels a day. The US is in second place with production equaling 12%, or almost 11 million barrels daily. Russia also remains a massive producer, holding on to more than 11% of the world's share. That's just over 10 million barrels a day. China and Iran each produce little over 4 million barrels a day. That means they each produce more than 4% of all the world's oil. But more versatile than oil is natural gas. The US reclaims top position, producing 681 billion cubic meters annually. Its neighbor Canada is also a significant producer. Ranked second, Russia produced 592 billion cubic meters of gas in 2012. Iran is thought to have the world's largest gas reserves, but remains largely undeveloped, producing only 160 billion cubic meters. Qatar has emerged as a big player, producing 420 million cubic meters. It's now the world's largest exporter, supplying gas to more than 23 countries. Well, we're hearing these figures here, Cornelia Mayer, and we see that the US is at the top of the the gas producing list, near the top of the oil producing list. And yet it does seem that there can never be enough oil, is the spirit of that in many other countries. Would you agree?
Well, I would agree, given that we have the world population has reached 7 billion people. So there is, every barrel is needed, every solar panel is needed to feed the ever-increasing human population with the energy it needs. But when you look at gas, as Mr. van der Veulen has very clearly pointed out, it's a regional commodity bar LNG. And LNG, that's where Qatar is very active, has for the first time declined because of the huge shale gas revolution, which has powered also the US industry and made it again more competitive. So what we have seen over the last 5 years or so is that the US has become quite self-sufficient in terms of gas, as well as in terms of oil, and the flows, less in gas but in oil, have been redirected. For instance, Nigerian oil no longer goes to the US, it now goes to Asia and Europe. So things are changing around because as new centers of excellence emerge.
Well, Mamdouh Salameh, it appears to be a picture of pieces moving around a vast chessboard that at the moment the US is developing its natural gas industry. It's requiring less from the outside. But this is always shifting, is it not? There's no stage at which we say, here we've reached a settled position within the world demand and supply of oil and gas.
Some of the figures I heard are very exaggerated. There are a lot of question marks on the size of the proven reserves of Saudi Arabia and Iran. Vis-a-vis the shale oil and gas production in the United States, again, there is a lot of hype about that. The United States is producing now around 7.5 million barrels a day, including shale oil. The entire U.S. production currently amounts to 1% of the global oil supplies, and it is going to grow possibly to 2 or 3% by 2035. So talking about oil, shale, and gas revolution in the United States is highly exaggerated. I know the United States is becoming more self-sufficient in terms of shale gas, but for oil, the United States will remain dependent on oil imports for the foreseeable future. Nevertheless, we have to think of the global oil market and think of peak oil. The global oil reserves are depleting fast, and we are not replacing what we are consuming very quickly. So far, the world is consuming more than 32 billion barrels a year. We are replacing around 7% of that. So there is a growing deficit between global supplies and global consumption, particularly from the Asia-Pacific region. That's why that will be reflected in coming years in the price of oil. I can see that the price of oil is an ascending trend and will continue to do that for the foreseeable future.
Well, Cornelia Mayer, that point about the price of oil, it may at times be used as a bargaining chip, it would appear. There's been speculation, for example, that the US could release some of its massive oil reserves into the market, bringing down the price of oil, having a massive impact on the Russian economy, given, as we heard, that half of its budget comes from oil and gas sales. Is this fanciful, the fact of oil being used as a weapon, as people actually manipulating it to be able to create what are effectively sanctions?
I would say that the price of oil always is subject to geopolitical imbalances and geopolitical threats. But in the long run, we have to see that in the medium term, we have to see currently, if you look at production and consumption, we are sort of just about amply supplied. And as a previous speaker has pointed out, oil is a global commodity, so will even itself out on a global basis. So I would not say so. As to peak oil, we have been sort of running out of oil within 40 years for the last 150 years. There's always that next frontier, that next technology, that next find. So I'm not that worried. Especially in the longer run, there will be more and more substitution also by some renewable sources. We are way off from a technological side in how effective that can be, but the world is moving on, and so for the medium-term future, I see us well supplied with oil. Currently, we are around $100 a barrel. That's sort of a nice equilibrium price. Yes, there will be spikes if there's geopolitical tension, and yes, there will be troughs if something positive happens.
Well, Ben van Hovelen, I just want to broaden this out a bit and take a look at. We have seen, for example, conflicts arising in the name of democracy, for example. There have been invasions of countries to bring democracy to the people. Yet there always seems to be on these occasions, somewhere in the background, oil lurking. If democracy is present, can the oil companies be far behind? This, once again, has appeared to be a pattern. Is that a fair comment, do you believe?
I think the right way to think about this is to say that countries define their foreign policy interests according to, in large part, their economic interests and their energy interests. So if you look at instability in a place like Iraq versus instability in, say, Southeast Africa, the reason that the U.S. would get involved in the one place but not the other, in part, is because the government feels it has strategic interests there. So I think that it is fair to say absolutely that oil and energy is a big factor in these huge consequential foreign policy decisions, and that it can be a driver of things like war. But I think that it would be overstating the case to say that, for example, the U.S. invaded Iraq in order to gain access to fields for its companies. I think probably the better way to think about it, and the more accurate way to think about it, is that the direct benefit to the U.S., to Europe, of these democracy projects, as you put it, is that if you can bring the global companies into an oil sector, they're going to be typically much better at providing more production more quickly than a national government is. So if you can create a scenario where you have a relatively free market, you have competition, and you have international companies coming in, then you can probably expect that there's going to be more global supply, which will drive down prices and help the global economy.
Well, Mamdouh Salameh, your view on this wider issue. We heard what Ben had to say there about the intervention and the involvement of trained professional people in terms of the industry. But you've got an example of Libya, for example, massive oil reserves, massive gas reserves. Once again, there was a fight, we are told, for democracy there. Yet the oil production has dropped significantly, and it has become, it would appear to be, very much a Wild West type market with no controls whatsoever over the transportation or exportation of oil. Your view?
They talk about democracy to cover their greed for oil. Take the case of Libya. Before the latest troubles in Libya, Libya was producing 1.6 million barrels of oil and exporting 1.25 million a day to Germany, France, and Spain. Since then, and particularly after the unfortunate intervention of NATO, Britain, France, and the United States, now Libya could hardly produce enough for domestic consumption, which amounts to around 400,000 barrels. They are producing 250,000, so they are not satisfying the demand. And the situation will continue like this, as happened in Iraq, which before the invasion in 2003, they were producing, despite the sanctions, 3.3 million barrels a day. Now, after the invasion, they are not exceeding that figure.
Let me just go to, if I may,
apologies
to interrupt you there, Mamdouh Salameh, but I just want to go to Cornelia Meyer on that particular point, the dropping of oil production in terms of times of conflict. Now, clearly this is not intentional. The conspiracy theorists would argue that perhaps it is. Your view?
No, I would say it's certainly not intentional, but it is what happens. If you bring conflict to a country, and as the previous speaker said, if you destabilize the country, especially look at a place like Libya, or even at its height, though it was only 3% of global oil production. But if you look at a place like Libya, which is highly, highly tribal, so you remove that probably not very democratic, not very nice figure, but the tribes will come out and it will destabilize. Same thing in Iraq. You remove the very strong dictatorial figure, and so you will have more forces competing. So in the medium term, you see a decline of the production, and you see a destabilization of the country. And very often the West doesn't really know that. Well-intentioned go in to promote democracy, get rid of a dictator, but don't really quite understand the society, the picture of the society, the alliances, and it's not usually as easy as good guys and bad guys. There's all sorts of people, some of whom are quite unsavory characters.
Well, Ben van Hervelen, the elephant, as it were, in the room here hasn't really been directly mentioned, is China, a massive consumer of oil and of gas. Yet it appears to adopt very pragmatic policies in terms of where it gets its resources from, does it not?
Absolutely, it does. And one of the interesting things about China and the way that it pursues resources around the world is, first of all, it's very willing, pragmatic would be one way to put it, but another way to put it is that it's willing to do deals with unsavory regimes. So throughout the Gulf of Guinea and Africa, for example, there's a great deal of Chinese oil investment. And then one of the other things that China does very well to get a competitive advantage over other international companies is the Chinese companies are very closely related to the government. And so what China can do is, instead of just doing a straightforward contract where a company says, I'll take oil out of the ground and take this much profit, the Chinese government can come in and say, we'll do that deal where we take oil out of the ground. In addition, we can build you roads or provide needed infrastructure. And oftentimes these weaker governments in developing countries will not have the institutional capacity to do projects like this themselves. And so they see China's offer as essentially doing the government's job for them. And this makes China competitive in a way that other companies can't be.
Well, many ways of doing business within the oil industry and many consequences. My thanks to our guests, Mamdouh Salameh, Cornelia Meyer, and Ben van Hervelen. And a reminder, you can find this program and many more at aljazeera.com. Just follow the links for shows and Inside Story. Thanks for watching. I'm Mike Hanna. Goodbye for now.